February 2nd, 1943. Friedrich Paulus, the first German field marshal to ever surrender, stands in a frozen Stalingrad basement surrounded by 91,000 skeletal soldiers who once seemed invincible. What followed was a journey so brutal that only 6,000 would ever see Germany again. But here's what nobody talks about. The surrender wasn't the worst part, not even close. Because after these men laid down their weapons, they faced over a decade of horrors that would make the battle itself look merciful by comparison. This is their story, and it's not for the faint of heart. Before we get to what happened to these prisoners, you need to understand why it happened. Because the Eastern Front wasn't like other fronts in World War II. This was an ideological war of annihilation from the very beginning. In the summer of 1941, over 3 million German troops launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. The initial weeks saw the German blitzkrieg just decimating Soviet forces. Hundreds of thousands were captured, vast territories fell, cities collapsed like dominoes. But the Germans weren't just conquering, they were exterminating. Nazi ideology viewed Soviet people as subhuman, and Red Army soldiers who surrendered were routinely shot on the spot or marched to camps where they were deliberately starved to death. There were documented cases of Soviet POWs kept behind barbed wire without food or water until every single one died. Witnesses said that for an arm's length around the wire, there wasn't even grass left. Prisoners had eaten everything they could reach. The whole process spiraled into something darker than conventional warfare. The Germans committed massacres in villages suspected of harboring partisans. Soviet civilians were herded into churches that were then set on fire. We can't describe all the atrocities here without this video being taken down, but you can research the details yourself. Just imagine for a second, most of your family murdered, your village burned, your country invaded by an army that considers you less than human. Now imagine that army is defeated and its soldiers are at your mercy. That's the context, revenge and retribution. Keep those two words in mind because they explain everything that's coming next. By late 1941, however, things began to shift. The German advance bogged down. A winter colder than any in decades set in. The Soviets pulled what you might call an Uno reverse. Except it wasn't quick or simple. It was grinding, brutal, and it would culminate in the catastrophe at Stalingrad. Hitler ordered that Stalingrad must be captured and held at any cost. That cost would be catastrophic. By late August 1942, Luftwaffe bombers dropped over 1,000 tons of bombs on the city. In just over a week, roughly 40,000 civilians died in the firestorm. Stalin kept around 400,000 civilians trapped in the ruins, forced to dig trenches, build fortifications, and serve as human shields for the defense. He also issued Order 227, not one step back. Any retreat was punishable by death. Blocking detachments were positioned behind Soviet lines with orders to shoot anyone retreating. Your only option was forward into German fire. The battle descended into something the Germans called rat war. Picture this. Combat so close, you could have a German squad on the second floor of a building, a Soviet team in the basement, and another Soviet group in the attic, all in the same ruined house. Soldiers fought room to room, floor to floor. At this range, rifles were useless. Submachine guns, grenades, shovels, and bayonets became the primary weapons. Soviet troops used cellars and sewer tunnels to launch surprise attacks from every direction. Snipers and booby traps killed everything that moved. The city became a graveyard where buildings served as tombs for the living. German assault groups pushed to the Volga River and nearly broke the Soviet defense. But the Red Army clung to a thin strip along the water, maybe a tenth of the city, and refused to let go. While the Germans bled themselves dry in the ruins, their flanks stretched across the open steppe were held by Romanian armies, poorly equipped, thinly spread, with almost no anti-tank weapons. What do you think the Soviets were about to do? They massed 1.1 million men and over 800 tanks in complete secrecy. False radio traffic, night movements, dummy bridges to fool German reconnaissance. Everything was set without the Germans noticing a thing. At dawn on November 19, 1942, Soviet forces struck from two directions simultaneously. T-34 tanks rolled through Romanian positions that had nothing to stop them. Within days, the two Soviet spearheads met 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The trap snapped shut. Inside the ring, roughly 250,000 to 300,000 Axis troops cut off from fuel, food, and any hope of rescue. General Paulus begged Hitler for permission to break out while they still had fuel for their panzers and while the encirclement wasn't yet airtight. Hitler's response: hold at all costs, no retreat under any circumstances. That order sentenced every man inside to death or captivity. Hitler promised the Luftwaffe would supply the army by air. 6th Army needed about 700 tons of supplies daily: food, fuel, ammunition, medical equipment. Listen to this. From the very beginning, air transports delivered only about 85 tons per day on average, and most of that was fuel and ammunition, not food. It wasn't long before the encircled army spiraled into the darkest nightmare imaginable. But they didn't even know this was only the beginning, and the worst was still yet to come. Hunger and cold killed as many men as combat. Bodies couldn't be buried. The ground was frozen solid. Disease spread like wildfire: dysentery, typhus, frostbite, gangrene. Rations shrank to crumbs of frozen bread and scraps of horse meat boiled in filthy water. There were accounts of men eating things we can't mention on YouTube. Use your imagination. Ammunition ran so low that anti-tank gun crews received a single shell per day with orders to fire only when a kill was guaranteed. The airlift itself was bleeding out. Soviet tanks overran the main airbase and deliveries dropped even further. Outside the pocket, however, there was hope, at least for a while. On December 12th, 4th Panzer Army launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate relief attempt. They fought to within 30 miles of the encircled forces. Men inside Stalingrad could hear the distant thunder of artillery. Field Marshal Manstein privately urged Paulus to disobey Hitler and break out from the inside to link up with the rescue force. Paulus refused. He didn't dare defy the Führer. Not yet. This was their last chance, and they didn't take it. The Soviets reinforced the ring from both sides and smashed the relief force. Within days, it was over. The only army that could have saved them was beaten back. They were completely alone. Discipline collapsed inside the pocket. Officers executed their own soldiers for attempting to surrender. Paulus himself finally realized Stalingrad would be their cemetery. Many soldiers took what they considered the easy way out, if you understand what that means. By late January 1943, the army had fractured into isolated pockets. No airstrips remained. Supply drops fell blindly at night, and Soviet troops captured most of them. Some desperate groups tried breaking out on foot, but hundreds of miles of frozen steppes separated them from German lines. The few who tried were never seen again. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. It was a dark hint. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler was telling him to die. But on January 31st, when Soviet troops closed in for the final assault, Paulus finally chose to disobey. He ordered his men to surrender. The next day, February 2nd, 1943, more than 90,000 men, starved, frostbitten, barely clinging to life, laid down their weapons. And yet, believe it or not, this was still not the worst part of their ordeal. What came next would make everything they'd already endured seem almost merciful by comparison. Soviet commanders ordered the city cleared immediately. Walking prisoners were force-marched to the rear, sometimes over 50 miles through deep snow in temperatures below -20 degrees. These men were still wearing summer uniforms. They improvised clothing from rags scavenged in the ruins, wrapping their feet in strips of cloth, bundling themselves in anything that might provide warmth. Anyone who couldn't keep pace was either shot or left to freeze in the snow. Food came randomly, if at all. A piece of frozen bread, thin soup occasionally. Nothing more. Just days after surrender, out of 91,000 men, only about 35,000 reached the prison camps alive. But the journey didn't end there. Prisoners were moved from camp to camp, sometimes on foot, sometimes crammed into cattle wagons where half died during longer transports. Those who survived were sorted upon arrival. Senior officers with propaganda value, separated. Doctors and engineers set aside for their skills. Ordinary soldiers organized into labor battalions. The Soviets had a policy. These men would rebuild the country they'd destroyed. Only then could they go home. They were sent to coal mines, railway construction, clearing bombed cities, and they were at the absolute bottom of the Soviet food chain. Lower than Soviet prisoners, lower than Soviet civilians who were themselves starving. German soldiers were literally worked to death. Diseases tore through overcrowded, filthy camps. German doctors tried helping with almost no medical supplies. Most treatments came down to vodka for disinfection and pain relief, when vodka was even available. Remember, many who surrendered were already wounded from combat. By this point, almost all of them were dead. Less than half of those sent to camps would survive. The war ended in May 1945. You might think that meant release. Well, no. When the war ended, around 2 million German prisoners remained scattered across the Soviet Union. They stayed right where they were, still subjected to forced labor under the reparations policy. The rule was simple. Finish your assigned project, then you can go home. Build the bridge, complete the railway line, clear the rubble. Only then do you earn release. But this privilege didn't extend to everyone. German families back home had no idea what happened to their soldiers. The Soviets kept almost no records, just rough numbers with no names attached. For years, wives and parents hoped that one day their loved ones would walk through the door. Prisoners were released gradually over the first 3 years after the war, but only a small fraction. The International Red Cross pressed the Soviets repeatedly. Despite international pressure, an estimated 85,000 German prisoners remained in captivity. Things only changed after Stalin's death in 1953. The political climate shifted. Western nations pushed harder for releases. Listen to this. In October 1955, a full 11 years after the war ended, the last group of 10,000 to 15,000 men were finally released. They arrived home by train, barely recognizable, some still wearing the tattered remnants of their Wehrmacht uniforms. The reunions were devastating. Children didn't recognize their fathers. Wives had remarried assuming their husbands were dead. Homes no longer existed. The men who returned were not the men who'd left. They were hollowed-out shells, destroyed by over a decade of unimaginable suffering. Out of more than 90,000 men captured at Stalingrad, approximately 5,000 returned home alive. They'd survived 12 to 15 years of captivity following a war they'd marched into as young men in their 20s. So what does this story actually mean? The Eastern Front reveals the cycle of brutality that war creates. Germany invaded with genocidal intent, murdering millions of Soviet civilians. The Soviets responded with their own brutality toward German prisoners. Neither side broke the cycle because both felt completely justified. German POWs suffered horribly, that's undeniable. But they were part of an army that starved cities, burned villages, and attempted to exterminate entire populations. Does their suffering erase what they participated in? Number. Does their participation mean they deserve to suffer? That's the question everyone must answer for themselves. Here's a perspective that might challenge you. Some historians argue Soviet treatment, while brutal, was actually restrained compared to what it could have been. Soviet citizens watched their families murdered and their cities destroyed. The fact that any German prisoners survived at all shows discipline, a system that used prisoners for labor rather than simply executing them in revenge. But other historians counter that suffering is suffering, that no political calculation justifies starving men to death, that basic human decency applies even to enemies, especially after surrender. Both perspectives have merit. That's what makes this history so uncomfortable. It offers no clean moral lessons. What's certain, roughly 85,000 German soldiers died in Soviet captivity after Stalingrad. They died in camps, on labor details, in unmarked graves across the Soviet Union. Their deaths don't balance the millions killed during Germany's invasion, Human lives don't work that way mathematically. But they remind us that war's cruelty extends beyond battlefields. It corrupts everything, turning victims into perpetrators and perpetrators into victims in an endless, grinding cycle. So here's my question. Knowing what Germany did to the Soviet Union, and knowing what the Soviets did to these prisoners, where do you draw the line? When does justified response become unjustifiable cruelty? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know, because this question has no easy answer. The German prisoners of Stalingrad didn't just lose a battle, they lost everything. Their defeat came slowly, over years, as they marched through frozen wastelands, wasted away in labor camps, and waited for a world that had already moved on without them. Their children grew up not knowing their fathers, their wives remarried, their homes were destroyed, and when they finally returned, if they returned, they came back as strangers to a country that wanted to forget they ever existed. If you want to discover how American tank radios gave Allied forces a shocking advantage that Germans never saw coming, check out the video on your screen right now.